Okay, so once again, welcome everyone. So good to have you back. This is, as we just mentioned, the fourth class in this series on navigating the employer-employee relationship with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. In this full series, we explore a number of topics that address the nature of the employer-employee relationship, highlighting rights and responsibilities on both sides. We encourage everyone to turn on your video if you are able, so we can feel like we are together in a traditional classroom. Of course, feel free to ask questions or make comments by writing them in the chat box here on Zoom, or as a comment if you're watching us live on Facebook. I believe Rabbi Ziring is also okay with people just unmuting and asking questions, correct?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Ziring.
Okay, great. Thank you, Evie. Good to see everyone. Okay, so this week we are going to deal with the issue of quitting in halakha. Now, quitting is a very interesting topic, as we'll see, because it really cuts to the heart of how halakha conceptualizes the relationship between an employer and employee, and specifically the status of an employee, and whether we view a worker as simply someone being paid for his time. And as we'll see, halakha seems to go out of its way to emphasize that that's really all it is, and to negate the possibility that we would treat an employee as a slave, even temporarily. And we'll see that halakha really tries to instantiate that into law. So I'll pull up the sources. So as we'll see, the issue of quitting and halakha is really divided into two related topics. One is the question of does an employee have the right to back out of a commitment? They agreed to work for a certain project, a certain time period. Are they allowed to back out, or does halakha constrain their ability to back out? And the second question is, even in a case where we would allow, and as we'll see, that's most of the time, if not always, an employee to walk out of an agreement, what are the potential consequences if, let's say, backing out of the deal leads to monetary losses by on behalf of the employer? So those are the two topics, and as we'll see, they're related, but those are the two halakhic issues that we need to address. So just to get some of the basic sources down, here in source one, this is the first two mishnayot in the sixth parak of Mitzia. These first mishnayot deal with the question of liability. So the Mishnah tells you, if you hire artisans or laborers and they deceive one another, so ein lahem ze al ze ela taromet. All they can do, they have nothing but grievance against one another, meaning under normal circumstances, there are no financial claims that can be levied against the party that backed out. Sachar et hachamor vet hakadar lavi periafrin v'chalilim lekala o lamet upoalin lahalot pishtano min ishra v'kol davar sha'aved v'chazru behen makom shein sham adam socher alein o matan. But then the Mishnah tells you, however, if you hired workers to play music at a wedding, or you hired a donkey driver, or a potter, or laborers to bring flax from the tub in which it was produced. In all these cases, there is a monetary loss if the worker backs out. Let's take the easiest to understand there, the case of the flax, where once it's soaking, there's a certain amount of time in which it needs to be processed. And if not, then the potential linen will be destroyed. So in such a case, then it depends. If it's easy for the employer to find someone else to do the task, so then there is no monetary responsibility on behalf of the employee. However, if there is no one to easily be hired for the job, then they can even hire replacements at a higher rate. And that expense comes from the first workers because their backing out of the deal caused this monetary loss to the employer. The second Mishnah tells us that hasochar ena umanim v'chazru behen. If you hire artisans to perform work and they renege, yadan ala tachtona. So whoever backs out, in this case the employee, their hand is they are the disadvantage. Literally, their hand is underneath, but meaning they have the legal liability. In balabayit chozer bo, and if the employer backs out, so then yado ala tachtona, then he is going to be the one that's liable. And kol mishaneh yado al tachtona. In general, anyone who diverges from the original plan is the one with legal liability. Chozer bo yado ala tachtona. So the first thing that we see in the Mishnah is that if an employee backs out and the employer can easily replace the employee, then it might not be nice. But as the Mishnah says, it's not nice. You can complain. You can say, we had a deal. It wasn't nice of you. You should have listened. You should have kept your end of the bargain. But on a legal level, the worker has the right to back out of the deal. In certain circumstances, however, when, because of the short time frame that the employee gave to the employer to find suitable replacements, because this job is time sensitive, in such a case, the worker can still back out, but they are liable. Now, what's fascinating here is that the assumption in the Mishnah is that workers can back out. In some cases, they can back out and there's no legal liability. In some cases, they can back out and there is legal liability. But the Mishnah doesn't raise the possibility here that, let's say, in the case where their backing out will lead to a monetary loss for the employer, that the employee can't do that because they're harming the employer. And that's really quite striking because normally you can't. Right? You can't damage other people monetarily. And usually when you're causing someone monetary loss intentionally, or you're doing something intentionally rather that causes someone monetary loss, we wouldn't just say that, well, you're liable. We might say, well, maybe you shouldn't do it. Maybe you can't do it. But here, that isn't entertained. So why is that the case? Right? Why is it the case that that you are allowed, that the Gemara takes it as, the Mishnah takes it as an assumption that if an employee wants to back out, he can. So here I'll skip for a moment to number 3. And this comes from a very fascinating claim earlier in Bava Metzia, where the Gemara is talking about something completely different. The Talmud is talking about the laws of lost objects, of hashavat avedah, the obligation to return a lost object, and the cases in which when you find a lost object, you're allowed to keep it. So the Talmud quotes Rava as saying, Eitve Rava l'Rav Nachman mitziad poel le'atzmo. If a worker finds a lost object while he's working for his employer, he's allowed to keep the object. So Gemara says, Bamedvar mamurim, in what case do we assume that the worker's time is his own, such that a monetary boon that comes to him in the middle of working, and possibly because of the work, right? He's was hired to schlep, right, to carry things through from the employer's house to the market, and along the way he finds something. So he was only in that place at that time because of the job. Whatever, come up with whatever case you want. He's allowed to keep the object. So the Talmud says, "Bamedvar mamurim." Under what circumstance is that said? Bisman she'amar lo bal habayit nakesh imi hayom ador imi hayom aval omer lo asei mi malach hayom mitziato shebal habayit. So the first suggestion by the Talmud is it depends. If the worker was told by the employer, do this specific task, weed for me, till for me. So then, since the employer specified the task that the worker was supposed to do, so then when he found the lost object, it wasn't in the process of weeding or tilling or building or whatever the case may be. And therefore, it's obvious that the worker is allowed to keep the object. However, the Talmud assumes that maybe if he just said, work for me today, like I have a whole bunch of things that I need you to do, I'll pay you a flat rate for the day. So then the Talmud says, maybe in that case, because the employer hired this worker for anything he needs during the day, so maybe his time is not his own, and therefore the object should go to the employer. But then the Talmud rejects it, and it says, no, Amar le shiny poel diyado keyad balabaitu. And he says, right, so I won't get into all the details here of how this contradicts Rav Nachman from a previous part. So let's just skip that for the moment. But then the Talmud says, but wait a second. Rava says, wait a second, regardless of what's going on and what Rav Nachman said before, isn't it true that a laborer, a worker, can always quit his job even in the middle of the day? And if that's the case, doesn't that show that the relationship is set up for the advantage of the employee? And therefore, maybe that explains why he should always be able to keep the lost object. And he says, no, Amar kol kamad lo hadarbe kiyad balabayit. No, maybe the case is that, look, as long as he doesn't quit, so then he is an extension of the employer, and therefore the lost object goes to the employer. Kihadarbe, but when he does retract, why is he allowed to retract? Taima achrinahu, for an external reason, a different reason. Dichtiv, because the verse says, the Torah says, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim, that the Jews are my slaves, meaning God. Avadaihim, my slaves, v'lo avadim la'avadim, and not slaves to other slaves. And here the Talmud really says, presents something very surprising. And it says, so if we follow the logic of the Talmud, it seems to be as follows. Originally, the Rava believes that if a worker cannot back out of a deal, then that shows that his relationship with the employer is fundamental, is intrinsic. And therefore, it would make sense that if he finds a lost object during the day, it would go to the employer. However, if he can back out, so doesn't that indicate that he really is working, I don't know, for himself? He's independent and he's not fundamentally linked to the employee, to the employer. And to this, the Talmud says it's not true. Maybe he is linked to the employer, but the reason he's allowed to back out of the deal is because you can never stop an employee from backing out of a deal because Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim, because the Torah says that we are slaves to God and we can't be slaves to other slaves. Now, this is a really surprising statement because what the Talmud here seems to be suggesting is that to say that an employee can't back out, can't quit in the middle of a job, even though, as we saw in the Mishnah, sometimes that's going to cause a monetary loss, is to essentially transform a worker into a slave. And the Torah says that cannot happen, right? A laborer, a worker, an employee cannot be conceptualized as a slave. And therefore, he must have the ability to back out in the middle of a deal, even though it causes monetary loss, even though there may be monetary consequences. You can't fundamentally curtail his right to back out. And that seems to be why, as we saw in the first source, the Talmud is willing to entertain the financial liability for a worker who backs out and leaves the employer hanging. But it seems to take it as a given that an employee can back out. And then the Talmud introduces this idea because if not, you've transformed an employee into a slave. Okay, let's pause there. Those are the two main ideas, right? One is liability, but with the assumption that at least quitting is permitted, right, is a possibility. And the second point, which is the reason that quitting seems to be fundamentally permitted, is because otherwise you've turned an employee into a slave. rather than a laborer. Okay, those are the two main ideas. Before we go on to the sources, thoughts, questions about what we've seen so far and what this tells us about the way that the Torah conceptualizes the employer-employee relationship. And if not, we will we'll continue to flesh these things out inside. Okay, I don't see questions, so we will we'll continue. Okay. Okay, in the middle here, in the continuation of the Gemara just gets into some details of what it means for there to be a loss to the employer. But for now, let's skip that and move on to flesh it out. So right off the bat, what we see is that this question of whether a worker can back out of a deal seems to, as I said, cut to the fundamental question of how do we conceptualize a worker in halacha. The Yerushalmi seems to attack this head on in a very short piece, but in many ways a much more conceptually suggestive formulation. So the Yerushalmi, after quoting that same Mishnah, or on the same Mishnah, says as follows: Rav Amar, Kili b'nei Israel avadim. The Torah says that the Jews are servants to God, or slaves to God. From here we learn, Ein Yisrael konin ze et ze. Jews cannot buy one another. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Eved Ivri hi matnita. Rabbi Yochanan said this was about a Jewish slave. Al daiti de Rav. Right? Now Rav says, Bein poel, bein balabayit yachol lachzor bo. Both a worker and an employer can back out. Al daiti de Rabbi Yochanan, poel yachol lachzor bo, vilo balabayit. So the Yerushalmi seems to quote this same idea, Kili b'nei Israel avadim, that there is some fundamental limitation on employment because of this idea that it weighs in, it makes, not letting someone quit, turn someone into a slave. But you have two different approaches. Rav says that Ein Israel konin ze et ze. Jews can't buy one another. Now, this is complicated by the fact that there is an institution of slavery, and in that case, you sort of can. But at least when you're not actually dealing with slaves, and again, this complicates the picture of slavery, Rav says, so fundamental is it to the employer-employee relationship that you can't really acquire somebody else. You can't acquire your employee. That means that the employer and the employee can always back out of a deal. Now, why would that be the case? So it seems to be that according to Rav, if you wouldn't allow either side to back out, that would imply some permanent bond, not permanent, some irrevocable bond between the employer and the employee, and that whichever side can't back out, the fact that you don't let people end the deal indicates that at some level there is a slave relationship going on here. Because if it's just a deal, right? If it's just, I say I'm going to do something and you say you're going to do something, okay, that's one thing. And then maybe you could protect one side or the other. But if you say that fundamentally this relationship cannot be permanent and irrevocable in certain ways, it's just impossible. So neither side can back out, because otherwise it would create a problematic dynamic. And Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan limits the drasha, and we won't get into everything he says, but to an actual delivery. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it's not the case that the employer can back out. The employer is in fact limited, but he agrees that the employee, the worker, can back out. So definitely Rav's formulation in the Yerushalmi, I think, pushes the Bavli even farther. where it says, yes, the problem with not letting an employee quit, and for Rav, even not letting an employer out, is because you have transformed the relationship. You've essentially made it that the employer has bought the employee. And therefore, if the employee can't back out, that shows that he's a slave. If the employer can't back out, I assume what Rav would say, it's like, final sale when you go into a store and it says, listen, no returns, no refunds. Right? If you don't let the employer back out, then what you've essentially implied is that he's bought the employee with no refund. And that dynamic is impossible because in the end of the day, a worker is not a slave. Okay. Now, let's continue sort of expanding this conceptually. So if we turn now to source 5, Tosfot comments on this Gemara, and Tosfot asks, "V'im tomar, umay kamash malon." Why do you have to tell me that a employee can back out? We know that v'alo beperika umnin lo pligi Rabbi dosa v'Rabbanan ela de Rabbi Yossi savar diyad po'al al tachtona v'Rabbanan savar diyado al ha'alyona. In the later discussions in the Talmud, so there's an argument about who has the advantage in terms of monetary liability, the employer, the employee under different circumstances. But everyone agrees, as we already noted in that first discussion, everyone agrees that they can retract. Isn't it obvious? So Tosfot says, "Yesh lomar de kamash malan de yachal lachzor bo v'yado al yona kirabanan." He says maybe this position is following the position of the Rabbanan, that at least under the cases there in where the workers go up, the price goes up, that still the employees have the upper hand financially in terms of how we assess how much they owe. Now that's a bit of a surprising comment by Tosfot, because what Tosfot is assuming is that you could have just said, listen, the employee can back out because otherwise you're conceptualizing him as a slave, and that's problematic. However, the question of liability is entirely independent. But Tosfot pushes it farther, and Tosfot suggests that maybe if you really take this drasha seriously, if you take this idea seriously, that an employee has to be free to back out, so maybe you also have to minimize liability, because if you maximize liability, it might be that in theory the worker could back out, but in practice, it's nearly impossible. So Tosfot seems to push this idea even farther. And in his second comment, he writes, "Ki li ben Israel avadim, nira li di mikol makom mutar adam lahaskir atzmo." And now Tosfot comes to a surprising idea, and he says, okay, we've established that a worker must have the right to quit because otherwise he becomes a slave. We've suggested, perhaps even more than that perhaps if we really believe this, then we have to side with the positions in the Talmud. Again, we'll leave the details to the side, but with the positions that minimize liability, because otherwise you're creating, if not a absolute impediment to the employee quitting, you are creating a undue burden. But now Tosfos flips it and he says, okay, but if that's the case, if we are so opposed to setting up a worker relationship that might in any way become conceptualized like a slave relationship, so then Tosfot says, so why are you allowed to hire yourself out at all, right? Maybe you should have taken this farther and said, listen, maybe you're never allowed to hire yourself out as a worker because inherent in employment is some type of slavery, right? I'm committing to a job for the next week, for the next 2 weeks, for the next month. I'm curtailing my freedom. I want to be able to travel. I want to be able to go out of town, but I know I need to be up first thing in the morning to work. at my job. I can't do that if I've committed to a month. So maybe you should have taken this farther, and you should have said that maybe employment, definitely at times employment, is fundamentally problematic. And he says no, right? You have to balance. You still can hire yourself out. Because he says in the end of the day, unless someone is an actual slave, where they can't back out, there's no way to back out, right? Or in the case of an Evet Ivri, he can back out, but it's not really backing out. He has to buy himself back. It's not slavery. And what Tosfot seems to do is set up a very interesting dynamic, where on the one hand, he really pushes this idea quite far, that we have to do everything in our power to make sure that a worker can back out, and maybe even minimize the liability such that he doesn't just have a theoretical, but a practical ability to back out, because otherwise it's slavery. But on the other end, he recognizes that while you might want to conceptualize every type of work as especially work by time, we'll see that it might be different by task, but at least work where you commit to a week, a month, or something like that as some sort of slavery, we don't. And we say, listen, in the end of the day, the fact that you can back out, even if this shares some similarities, it isn't slavery, even though we recognize that maybe in certain ways, all employment is a curtailment of the freedoms of the employee. We understand that, but still it's not slavery. And therefore we permit the institution of employment. But the fact that he needs to negate the possibility that it would be forbidden to have employment shows you just how much he thinks that halacha is trying to balance, on the one hand, the necessity of having the possibility of employment, but recognizing the inherent dangers that employment can so easily turn into slavery. I see a question. Yes, so as Beth notes that the Talmud also argues, based on the exact same verse, that avadai heim, that an Evet Ivri, a Jewish slave who is a slave, but even the Jewish slave, if after his 6-year term, he has the ability, if he wants, at least under certain circumstances, to extend his slavery until the Yovel. But if he chooses that path, so then the slave has to go to the door and have his ear pierced by the door. And the Talmud says, why? Why his ear? Because Ozen Sheshama Bar Sinai, an ear that heard at Sinai, Avadai Haim, that we are the slaves of God, V'lo avadim lavadim, and therefore we can't be subservient to people, has to be pierced because he missed the message. So yeah, as Beth says, exactly, right? So much so do we believe that we should avoid slavery, that even in the institution of slavery, where the Talmud does, where the Torah does allow a certain type of slavery, we don't allow absolute slavery and eternal slavery between Jews. And if someone wants to extend their slavery, even though it's not forever, but until the Yovel, we punish them, as it were, for not understanding that there's something inherently problematic with being subservient to other people. Okay. Now, in the Sifra, which is a Midrash Halakha from the Tannaitic period, same period as the Mishnah, you now get the flip. You get a flip, an opposite point, which highlights something very interesting. The halacha is as follows. The Torah says, "La'olam bahem ta'avodu, ein lecha bahem el avoda bilvad." When you have a slave, now we're talking about actual slaves. So these are idolatrous slaves, a Kanani. So they work forever. But Jewish slaves, ein le'el ish be'ish, ish isha be'ish, ish be'isha, isha be'ish minayin. So the Talmud says, how do I know that men can acquire female slaves, females can acquire male slaves? Talmud lomer ish b'achiv mikol makol. Okay, but the most surprising line is the following: Lo tirdeh bo bifarech. When someone has a Jewish slave, you cannot work them hard, right? Too hard. And then the Sifra says, Bo einata rodeh bifarech. an actual Jewish slave, you can't work oppressively. But rodeh ata b'ven chorin bifarech. But you can work a free person, meaning your employee, really, really hard. Now, this sifra to me really, really is amazing, because what this sifra says is, look, as I understand it, there are two ways to highlight the ways in which we don't really like slavery, and which the halacha really wants to prevent employment from becoming slavery. One is that even an actual slave, in the limited cases in which we actually have slavery, we don't let you work the slave oppressively, because we may have allowed slavery begrudgingly, but we're not going to allow you to, dehumanize essentially the slave, right, and work them harder than you would, let's say, a normal worker. That's point one, right? That even within the context of slavery, we're not thrilled with it, and it's only begrudging, and therefore we limit what you can demand. But then the Talmud says, but that limitation only applies to an actual slave, but a free person that you hire, you can work hard. Now, why would that be the case? So I think what the Sifra is getting at is that it's not about how hard you make them work. It's about what does that indicate about the relationship. If someone is a slave, so then if you treat them badly, right, that just highlights the extent to which you've dehumanized them. So we tell you, look, it's bad enough that the person's a slave, work them normally. But if someone you hire someone and the terms of the employment are clear, as long as they agree to it, you can work them really hard, because in the end of the day, it may be hard, but the fact that they entered into it of their own volition and they knew what they were getting into means that the relationship isn't slave-like. And therefore, what you see from the Sifra is that the Torah is trying to limit the existence of slavery in the employer-employee relationship, both by limiting the slave qualities of actual slavery, but in the context of employment, it's highlighting the fact that, listen, on the one hand, we always have to let him back out of the deal, because otherwise you've enslaved him. But because once we've done that, once we've set up these parameters that make it clear that an employee is not a slave, so you can actually demand more of your employee than you could of a slave, because they're entering it of their own volition, working them really hard doesn't transform that labor into slave labor. Okay, so if we continue, I want to show you how this plays out here. I put in 7. I'll say this outside. The Pirchei Choshen notes that there is a dispute. The Zera Emet, in a responsa, argues that normally a employee can back out of a deal, as we've seen. However, if when an employee is hired, he explicitly tells an employer, I am accepting this job on condition that I don't back out, so then he can't back out. Now, what the Zera Emet seems to believe is that this limitation is not fundamental, right? It's not fundamental to the employer-employee relationship that the employee not be able to back out, that the employee not have freedom. It's simply the default that we don't want you to have a relationship in which the assumption is that the employee is stuck, is enslaved, as it were, to the employer. But if the employee wants to, of his own volition, say, you know what, I'm committing to you and I'm committing that I won't back out, that works. But as the Pirchei Choshen notes, the Pirchei Choshen says it's not true. The simple understanding of the later authorities is that even if the employee wants to, even if the employee says, I am committing to work for you and I am doing it on condition I don't back out, that doesn't work. Why? Because that is slavery, right? Now, is that because you could look at it in different ways? You could suggest that if the possibility exists that an employee can bind himself to not back out, then that will create a reality in which employers will look for workers who are disadvantaged and will make that deal, and therefore we have to negate that possibility. Or you could just say that no, it's not just that we don't want employers taking advantage of employees and making them like slaves, but it's problematic, as Beth noted before. We actually think it's a religious problem for the employee to view themselves as a slave, just like we do by an actual slave, where we punish them for trying to extend their slavery, right? It's not just that this is a right of the employer. It's actually an expectation of the employee to recognize their freedom, because that's religiously valuable, not just as a way of protecting the employee, but it's religiously valuable, I think, for the way the employee conceptualizes himself or herself within the relationship. So either as a super protection for the employee, or in order to ensure that employees themselves don't come to view themselves as slaves, it seems, as the Pitchei Choshen notes, the majority view is that even if the employee wants to bind themselves such that they can't back out, we are not going to let them. It won't work. That's how fundamental it is to avoid this conceptualization of an employee as a slave. Sorry, the Pitchei Choshen is Rav Yeshaya Bloy, or Blau. He was a rabbinic judge in Israel, and he wrote I have it behind me, I think, a many volume work on a monetary law. You can see it here on the screen. Oh wait, I'm sharing my screen. I'll stop share for a second. If you can see here, Pitchei Choshen. This is actually the right volume on Hilchot Schirot on hiring workers. It's an excellent set. If you're interested in monetary law, there's a volume on employment. There's a volume on partnerships, on damages. So it's a good go-to for a compendium of modern practical SOC on monetary issues. Okay. Now, for a moment on the question of the liability. So as we've seen, even though we are very insistent that a worker not be turned into a slave, and therefore we allow them to back out, as we've seen, if they do back out under certain circumstances, there is monetary liability if they caused a loss to the employer. So the question we need to deal with is why? Because there's a general rule, as you see here in number 8, that hamekach eino nikneh b'dvarim. Normally you have a rule, something called kinyan dvarim, an acquisition of words, which doesn't work. Basically, if you just say, right, we'll just read this in the English here. The Rambam says, right, title to an article purchased is not acquired by verbal agreement alone, even if witnesses have testified to such an agreement. If, for example, one said to a person, I'm selling you this house, I'm selling you this wine, I'm selling you this slave, and both agreed on the price. The purchaser was pleased and said, I have bought it. And the seller was pleased and said, I have sold it. And they said to witnesses, you be our witnesses that A made a sale and B procured a purchase. This counts as nothing, as if there had never been an oral agreement between them. The same applies to a donor and a donee in the case of a gift. So one of the major problems is, okay, let's assume, as we know, that you can always back out. But why does the Mishnah even assume that if you do back out, there's going to be monetary liability? That assumes that there was a reality to this agreement that is at some level legally binding, even if we allow you to get out to prevent the conceptualization as a slave, the fact that there's legal liability implies that the deal is real. But how could it be real if, in the end of the day, what you did was you said, I'm going to work for you? Why does that create any legal liability, right? You should say not only is the employee allowed to back out, but there is no real commitment, and therefore there's no legal liability. And Rashi adds in number 9 that in such a case you can't even solve the problem with chalipin, right? With a symbolic handing over of a handkerchief. So why is it that if you're allowed to back out, why is it that nevertheless there's enough reality to this agreement that there is liability in cases where loss is incurred to the employer? So here we have several models. Rav Meir of Rutenberg, who is my wife's favorite Rishon, for reasons maybe we'll discuss at a different time, which is why my oldest child is named Meir after the Maharam Rutenberg. So Rav Meir of Rutenberg argues as follows. He says, "V'hapoel yesh lo din eved ivri, demehai time amrin poel yachol lachzer bo afilu b'chatzi hayom te'alfinin lami eved ivri." So the Maharam says something quite surprising. The Maharam says, until now we've been assuming that when the Talmud said you have to back out because you have to be able to back out of an employment relationship because otherwise you become a slave, that means that an employee is not a slave. The Maharam Rutenberg says, well, yes and no. The reason that you can back out is because if you can't back out, you'd be a full slave. But the reason that there's legal liability is because by hiring yourself out at some level, you did become a slave. And therefore, an employment relationship is not a mere agreement of words. You sold something real. You sold yourself. And therefore, the Maharam, right, seems to suggest something, right? Again, this seems paradoxical, that we learn that you can back out from the fact we don't want you to be a slave. We don't allow you to become a slave. But on the other hand, the reason you have liability is because at some level you are a slave. And therefore, when you commit to a job, you're committing to something real because you're committing of yourself. Now that obviously, if that model is true, it weakens the claim that we've been making about how seriously the Talmud believes that employment should be distinguished from slavery. But that's the argument of the Maharam Rutenberg. Others, however, suggest models that do not at all limit our belief that employment and slavery have to be fundamentally distinct. So, for example, the Ksora Choshen writes that when an employee hires themselves out, what they do is they make their assets, they put a lien essentially on their assets until they finish the work. So what the Ksod argues is that because of, right, when an employee hires himself to an employer and he knows that there may be loss if he backs out of the deal, he's allowed to back out of the deal because otherwise he would be like a slave. But in order to protect the employer, he doesn't just make a verbal commitment. What he's essentially doing when he makes a verbal commitment is he's putting a lien on his property that if I back out and cause you a loss, my property is liened to pay off that debt. And therefore, the commitment is real because he's actually transferring essentially a lien. He's at some level transferring his property to the employer. The Ramosha Feinstein seems to argue a different model, and that is that maybe essentially no, hiring yourself out for the duration of an employment, that is real, right? It may not be slavery, but you are essentially selling your time, and therefore that's real, and that's why there is a financial liability even if we let you back out, there is a reality to your commitment. Okay, so what we have is two models, whether it's you're selling your time or you're leaning your property to prevent loss and protect the employer. Those two models explain why, despite the fact that the employee can't be forced to work, he can be held liable if his quitting causes a loss to the employer. On the other hand, we have the Maharam Rutenberg, who actually says that the fact that there's liability is evidence of the fact that the equation between employee and slave is not complete, as we know from the fact that you can back out, but is also not completely non-existent, right? There is some reality to the fact that even when you hire yourself out for a job, you are at some level selling yourself to your employer. And that, as I said, does at some level weaken the conceptual argument of the opposition that the Talmud has of viewing a worker as a slave. Okay. Now, as we saw earlier in the Pitchei Choshen, that there are some thinkers who believe that if a worker chooses to essentially enslave himself to the employer, he's allowed to. We have a parallel distinction here. So the Ritva, Rabbi Yom Tov Asvili, argues that, in fact, if the only reason that an employer can back out, employee can back out, is because it's a kinyan dvarim, because the acquisition of work is not real. However, if they were to make the obligation real by doing a kinyan, by doing some sort of transaction, a symbolic transaction, so then he would not be able to back out. So again, the Ritva seems to be limiting the idea and saying, listen, an employee has the right to turn himself into a slave if he wants to. It's just not the default. But again, as we saw in the Pitchei Choshen, the majority view rejects this. And that's what the Shach writes here in 14. I'll just read the English. He says, the Ritva writes in the name of his teachers, the sages only said that a worker can back out if he hires himself out verbally. However, anyone who commits through an active transaction, it enhances the arrangement such that he can't back out. In my humble opinion, it seems that the other halakhic authorities who don't draw this distinction don't follow this view. They are correct in my humble opinion. Also, based on the reasoning of the children of Israel are servant to me and not servants to servants, it implies that a worker can back out in any instance. Right. So the Shach argues that no, again, here too, it can't just be that the reason that an employee can back out is because of a technicality that he never really committed, because the argument of the Talmud seems to be much more fundamental. And therefore, he argues that the majority view is that a worker rather, can always back out no matter how many deals he makes, no matter what he does to concretize his agreement. He cannot enslave himself, because that's fundamentally anathema to the nature of the employee-employer relationship. What I gave you here in 15 and 16 are two different analyses of the Yerushalmi's comments that we saw above, which attacked the idea of employment being viewed as slavery. We'll quickly look at them. The Netivot writes, the Netivot HaMishpat writes, "V'katuv etzli perish Yerushalmi mikvar." I've seen the Yerushalmi, the Rav Sover deleka kinyan klal midoraita b'pol Yisrael. Right, Rav believes that there is no acquisition at all in a worker. The only time that you can acquire someone is an actual slavery. Rak b'ivri bisman ha-yovel. Not yovel noheg. When slavery applies, so then there is. And skipping down, it says Rabbi Yochanan Sover David Ivrihu, the yesh bo kinyan. Right, so So the Netivot argues that perhaps, as we've seen, there is some disagreement about this idea that an employee is not a slave. And the Marami Rutenberg believes that maybe at some level an employee is a slave. So the Netivot HaMishpat argues that in fact that is the dispute in the Yerushalmi. That Rav who says that the employer and the employee can both back out, he believes that there is no acquisition of the personhood of the employee at all. And that's why everyone can back out. Rabbi Yochanan believes that no, like we saw already in the Marami Rutenberg, an employee is at some level a slave. The reason he can back out is because even slavery itself is not forever. And even slavery itself, a slave could buy himself back. And therefore, he argues that in the end of the day, the question of whether we really believe that an employment shares nothing with slavery is itself the dispute in the Yerushalmi. But again, if that's the case, then as we've seen, the majority view seems to be that we side with the position that that it's not slavery, right? That seems to be what emerges from the Shach, from the Pirchei Choshen, who say that every possible limitation, such as explicitly making a deal that you're not going to back out, or making a kinyan, right, making an acquisition to try to concretize your deal to not back out, none of that is going to work because we do everything in our power to make it that you can never, an employee can never be stuck in a situation that would transform them into a slave. Right, and the Aruch HaShulchan makes this point very clear that the real halacha that we learn from this is that you're just not able to bind yourself in this way. Okay. So again, to review what we've seen so far, we've seen there are two main questions in the issue of quitting. One is an employee allowed to quit? And the second is, if they do, is there liability? Now to work backwards from how we started, the Talmud is very clear, an employee can back out. And the reason is, according to the Bavli, because otherwise the employee will be viewed as a slave. According to what we saw in the Netivot HaMishpat, this might actually be a dispute in the Yerushalmi, where Rav, who says that an employer and an employee can back out, that indicates that the limitations on irrevocable employment is because an irrevocable deal would transform employment into slavery, and therefore the employer and the employee can walk out. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, believes that an employee can walk out, but an employer cannot. And based on this, Rabbi Yochanan believes that no, employment really is slavery, but just like slavery, the slave is not actually fully a slave, meaning that they can get out of it, at least in theory, because even slavery can't be permanent. So employment definitely can't be permanent. One way or the other, either because you believe that employment can't be slavery, or because even slavery can't be permanent, an employee can always walk out of the deal. Nevertheless, there's a certain amount of liability. Now, why is there liability? So we saw three possibilities. One is because, according to Marami Rutenberg, our assumption that employment is not slavery at all is not fully true. It is and it isn't. It's not fully slavery, and therefore you can walk out. But at some level, you are selling yourself, and therefore there's a reality to the commitment that an employee makes to the employer, and it's that reality that creates the legal liability. And then we saw two other models which maintain the notion that an employee is not a slave, and nevertheless explain why there could be liability, either because the employee essentially puts a lien on his property to protect the employer from loss, or because the employee is selling his time, and there is reality to that. And then we saw two cases that seem to test whether we believe that our opposition to an employee being viewed as a slave is only a default or is fundamental. And that is, one, whether when a employee concretizes their deal with a formal acquisition, does that prevent them from backing out? The Ritva says, yes. The majority view seems to be that no, even then they can back out because otherwise they would be a slave. And the second is, what if they explicitly make a condition, I won't back out? And again, the Pitkei Choshen notes the majority view is that seems not to work because, again, that would transform the worker into a slave. Okay. I see we have 5 minutes left, so let me just make a few brief points. Tosfot suggests here in 18 that this entire question only applies to an hourly worker, but not a worker hired by task, or what we call in Hebrew a kablan versus a poel or a sachir, someone who sells his time. Essentially what Tosfot says is if someone sells their time, so then if they can't back out, well, then they're a slave essentially. But if someone doesn't sell their time, they commit to accomplishing a task, right? You hire a tailor and they don't sell their time. They sell you a suit. So then, because the nature of the relationship is not one which can be slavery, because they're not committing their time to you. They're not making them yours. The employee is not making himself the employer's. It's like a store owner. He's selling something. It just happens to be that it's custom made. So in that case, because there is no slavery in the commitment, essentially he is a seller. He's a merchant. He's a contractor rather than a worker. Rabbeinu Tam argues that in such a case, these limitations do not apply. And in fact, he can be legally prevented from retracting. And this is ruled on lahalacha by the Pitkei Choshen. It does seem to be a widely accepted position. Now, and we only have 4 minutes left, so I won't be able to go through all the questions of liability, but just to tell you what you have here, as you see, the question of exactly how you define liability is quite complicated. And that to that extent, I simply gave you the entire, all the relevant halachot here in the Shulchan Aruch. And I gave you as well a summary here in the Pitkei Choshen for some modern takes on it. I just wanted to draw attention to one idea that I did find fascinating, is that we've been talking about this entirely from the vantage point of the employee. As we saw already, the employer also, under certain circumstances, can back out. However, interestingly, some poskim argue that in a case where the employee is poor, the employer can never back out because hiring a poor worker takes on the status of a vow. So I can't get into that too much here, but I think you have to remember that the flip side of this is that there are certain responsibilities from the employer to the employee, and recognizing the power dynamic, which we've been talking about, where usually the employer has the upper hand. This idea that an employer might not be able to back out, or might not to be able to back out in a case where the employee is particularly vulnerable, highlights, I think, very important things about how we view this relationship. In 24, and you can see, even though I'm not finished with the sources, but again, as I mentioned in the past, I don't put all the sources here with the plan of going through them. If you're interested with the topic, I want you to have reading material to look at it. So I gave you the Pitkei Choshen, the entire chapter on Chazar Poel, where he goes through the details of what we've seen, in terms of the ability of a worker to back out, and exactly how you assess the liability issues in a case where a worker does back out and loss is incurred. So if you're interested in looking into the details of that, so you have that here in the Pitkei Choshen, and I highlighted some of the interesting conceptual issues that appear in the footnotes there, which I've cut out, and that's in 25. But because it is time, so I will leave it there. And if there are specific issues you want to bring out, then now is the time. But thank you everyone for coming. Next week, just to tell you where we're going, the first 4 weeks we've really dealt with the halakhic issues that deal with the nature of the employee-employer relationship. Again, today focusing on the extent to which employment is slavery. In the next 2 issues, we're going to deal with cases in which employment raises moral issues that are not tied directly to the actual job per se. Specifically, what do you do when you have when unethical activity is being demanded of you in your job, either by an employer, an employee, a partner. And then in the last week, we're going to deal with whistleblowing, which is when you might not be involved in it yourself, but what is the responsibility of an employee to save other people from unethical behavior when there might be a loss to themselves by outing their employees. So that's the last 2 weeks. Thank you everyone for coming.
Should we take a couple questions, or maybe not today?
Of course. If there's any questions,
okay.
I am
maybe we can take 2 questions. And if anyone has a question, we can take a couple. And if not, we'll see each other again next week. Okay. So thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ziring. And thanks everyone who joined us here today on Zoom, on Facebook, and also on Drisha Live. We have another live class tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. It will be the 3rd class, I believe, in the series, The Invention of the 7-Day Week with Dr. Ezra W. Zuckerman-Sivan. You're also always welcome to find out more information about classes that are happening right now and upcoming class offerings, as well as the registration link for classes on our website, www.drisha.org/classes. You can also watch the classes live at www.drisha.org/live. Thanks again, Rabbi Ziring, for the opportunity to once again learn with you this week. And again, we hope to see everyone here at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha tomorrow or soon.